I'm sure that if you would have told my 9-year-old self that a movie called X2 was coming out, I would go like, Mega Man? X2 is directed by Bryan Singer, written by Michael Dougherty, Dan Harris, and David Hayter, and stars everyone from the first movie. That includes Hugh Jackman, Patrick Stewart, Ian McKellen, and now our big bad guys played by Brian Cox. And in X2, Brian Cox plays Colonel William Stryker, who is a military scientist who had been experimenting on mutants in the past, and now he's really out to get everybody. He has a personal vendetta against them. He finds a way to gain access to both Magneto and Professor X, and he just puts everyone in peril, and now Magneto and Professor X have to kind of join forces to be able to defeat this guy. Now I just thought of something when I was watching this movie, and after I watched it, I just kind of thought that it's funny for me when people are still surprised that the sequel turns out better than the original, because I'm not saying that that doesn't happen more often than the original being better than the sequel, but it's happened enough times now that I don't think it's really surprising. In my opinion, X2 is better than the first X-Men every way possible. In fact, I would go so far as to say that X2 is my favorite of the X-Men movies so far. I think it is definitely the best of the bunch we've gotten. Now, X2 was made in 2003, 3 years after the first X-Men. You can tell like their budget just like really, really went up. Like the production values are so much higher now. Everything is cleaned up. The visual effects especially are really cleaned up now. Like they still hold up to today. Wolverine's claws look more believable. You've got Lady Deathstrike in there who also has claws. Nightcrawler's special effects when he teleports and stuff, it's all very believable. And what I like is that you can tell the filmmakers are having so much fun with what all these mutants can do with their powers. It's not just a one-trick pony over and over again. Like the best example of this is Magneto. Like they keep finding new ways for Magneto to use his powers, and it's just so fun to watch. I think it's also notable that this movie, when it was first submitted for a rating, it was rated R because of apparently too much blood in the scenes where Stryker's men are raiding the X Mansion and stuff like that. But they cut some of those out, and it does kind of look somewhat cheesy when there's no blood. But it still looks fine. The makeup and the costumes are just as good as ever. The black leather suits kind of got modified a bit, and they do look better. Magneto's helmet doesn't look as claustrophobic as it did in the first movie. The makeup on Mystique still looks good. The makeup on Nightcrawler looks good. All in all, it's very, very well done. One problem I had with the first X-Men movie was that the locations didn't feel very believable. And here, I think they do fix that. I mean, the X Mansion, while it doesn't necessarily feel like a school, I mean, I don't think it's supposed to be like a full school. It does feel like a very big place. You can see students running around everywhere, and it just feels more populated. Now, when Nightcrawler appeared in this movie and he teleported, he made this sound that I don't know if all of you are familiar with the sounds that Nightcrawler's teleporting apparently makes in the comics, which is BAMF, BAMF. And it's kind of like how Wolverine's claws, when they come out, they make the sound snikt, SNIKT. And then I was just thinking, like, how much fun would that have been, like, to be in the sound editing room and trying to figure out how to translate these words into sounds. And, they do sound like the words. But anyway, getting back on track, the plotting in this movie also really, really impressed me because it's very, very complex, but it's very intelligent at the same time. Like, and what's so good about it is that it stays just on one track the entire time. Everything that happens in this movie is connected, and it really is just one straight plot happening despite all these characters. And speaking of characters, the characters here are very, very well defined now. Whereas in the first X-Men movie, like, Bryan Singer really did focus just on Wolverine and a bit of Rogue, and the other characters, were just given like a few lines, just enough to define their personalities. But here, you really get a sense of who these characters are. Like you can tell that there are things driving them. And what I think is so smart about the writing here is that the plot really is just on one track. However, like the writers and Bryan Singer really knew where to kind of put in little character moments. So, while this plot is going on, we can learn more about these characters without diverting from the plot. We don't go to any like sub story. And another thing that X2 has working for it in its writing is that the themes here really do start coming out. Whereas the first X-Men movie was a mutant versus mutant kind of thing. Like I really think it works better when Magneto and Professor X are on the same team, even if they're not necessarily you know they don't really agree on the same approach towards humans. It's fun to have them working together. It's really, really cool to see, and at the same time it's you see more clearly the division between humans and mutants, and you understand more why the humans don't like the mutants, etc., etc. And they really do touch on a lot of these, human reactions, like how Iceman's family doesn't really approve of him becoming, being a mutant, but they're kind of trying to understand why. And then you have Logan still trying to figure out his past, and it's great that even if everything else is happening, like the world is in danger, he's still really troubled about this mysterious past of his. We get more of the relationship between Magneto and Professor X, so it really does feel like they were friends way back then. And even Brian Cox's Stryker really has a backstory to him. And notice I've been talking about characters like all this time, and that's one thing I think really that this X-Men movie has going for it really, really strongly, is that the acting is also really, really well done everywhere. Hugh Jackman, again, like this is his role, and he adds another layer to his performance of Logan. This is definitely not as Wolverine centric as the first movie, and like everyone else here gets lots of time to shine. Also, like kudos to James Marsden, who I thought gives a really great performance, even if he barely has screen time. Anna Paquin as Rogue is also good. Sean Ashmore I thought was actually good as Bobby Drake or Iceman. Of course, Brian Cox is good as Stryker. Alan Cumming plays Nightcrawler, who I think he really played his role well. And kudos also to Famke Janssen, I think that's how you pronounce her name, Famke Janssen, for playing Jean Grey, and you're obviously going to see more of her in the future. However, I still think Ian McKellen's my favorite actor in this whole thing. Like the early 2000s were like Ian McKellen's years. He was Gandalf and he was Magneto, and he kills it here. And in terms of direction, I think Bryan Singer really ups his action directing. It's so much better now than in the first X-Men. You can see like real stunts happening. It feels very intense. And one thing about X2 is that the tone is much darker now, and I think that kind of does help it because whereas the first X-Men movie really did feel like this big Saturday morning cartoon at times, X2 really feels very serious about its subject matter, which is a real world problem. And like I mentioned a while ago, I think Singer really has a good grasp of all his characters and knows how they all relate to the same plot, so it never really diverts, it just stays on track. And I really honestly don't have that many negatives to speak of regarding this movie. Maybe it's a bit too long. Like I can admit that there's certain scenes that don't necessarily fit as well as I think they would have wanted them to. The fact that they're not really centering on Wolverine anymore, at least in this movie, it does allow for the other characters to have more screen time, but at the same time some characters end up getting the short end of the stick, like especially Cyclops, who has a big moment near the end that I just really wished he was in the whole movie more because of that moment. But I guess you can't really balance everyone, if, especially with a cast this big. But anyway, other than those things, like X2 is really, really good, man. While I mentioned, like I'm not surprised anymore when a sequel is better than the original, I am surprised when the middle chapter of a series, a trilogy, is the best. Because X-Men: The Last Stand, I'll talk about that later, and then X-Men, then X2 is, for me, it really does stand head and shoulders above the other two. And I have to wait a week until I see if X-Men Days of Future Past surpasses this one, but for now it is the standard, it's like the bar to beat. So that's my review for X2. Have you guys seen it? What do you think about it? Whether you loved it or hated it, whether you agree with me or not, please leave me a comment. Let's have a conversation.